Our panel today is entitled Legal, Religious, and Social Issues. We'll be following the program. The order of speakers will be as in the program. I'm just going to say just 2 or 3 sentences of introduction, and then we'll get going immediately thereafter. Our first speaker will be Ayesha Jalal, Professor of History here at Tufts and Director of the Center for South Asian and Indian Ocean Studies. A winner of the prestigious MacArthur Fellowship, Professor Jalal is the author of several books, the latest of which is the forthcoming Partisans of Allah, Meanings of Jihad in South Asia. Professor Jalal is one of the ornaments of Tufts University. We're very proud to have her here. She brings glory to us. Our next speaker will be David Kretzmer, Professor of Law at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. His latest book is entitled The Occupation of Justice, the Supreme Court of Israel and the Occupied Territories. No stranger to Tufts, Professor Kretzmer has been a visiting scholar at the Fletcher School as well as the Farrer Center, and we are delighted indeed to have him back here. Next will be Asad Abukhalil, Professor of Political Science at California State University, Stanislaus. His latest book is The Battle for Saudi Arabia, Royalty, Fundamentalism, and Global Power. Professor Abukhalil is a public intellectual of courage and conviction, qualities that are evident in his renowned blog, The Angry Arab News Service. Our discussant will be Ali Banuazizi, Professor of Cultural Psychology at Boston College, where he's also co-director of the Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies program. Professor Banuazizi, whose book, The New Geopolitics of Central Asia and its Borderlands, is one that I assign frequently to my classes, reached the pinnacle of our subfield when he served as president of the Middle East Studies Association of North America in 2004-2005. We're delighted to have such a distinguished panel here, and without further ado, I invite Professor Jalal to get us going. As you like.
Well, thank you, Malik, and thank you, Layla, for organizing this wonderful conference and giving all of us an opportunity to interact. I'd like to begin my remarks with 2 sets of quotations, which I think help me set up what I want to say in the next 15 minutes. Die now, in this love die. When you have died in this love, you will receive new life, unquote. And the second, we drink the wine of martyrdom, swinging in ecstasy. This living is not living. We live by getting our heads cut off. We became homeless for your religion. O Allah, accept our sacrifices, unquote. These 2 sets of utterances celebrating death for the love of Islam are different not merely in their poetic quality, but in what they convey about the religious and ethical sentiments of the 2 composers. The first, by the famous mystic poet Jalaluddin Rumi, is a variant of the famous Sufi dictum, to die before dying, in the struggle to be human, the greater jihad. The second, by Abdullah Shaban Ali of the Pakistani militant group Lashkar-e-Taiba, speaks of physical death in armed struggle against the enemies of Islam, the lesser jihad, leading to promised rewards in the hereafter. Both kinds of jihad have animated Muslims in varying measure depending on the historical context. To say that Rumi's conception of death is life-affirming, while the other, by the militant, is somehow life-denying, does at first sight seem a trifle unfair to the young man who cheerfully embraced martyrdom after killing 13 Indian soldiers in his quest for eternal life in paradise. A suspension of moral judgment in the true Sunni tradition might be tempting and is a tempting alternative given the human incapacity to second-guess the will of Allah. However, the ethical dilemma confronting the Muslim world today and Muslims in general really does not permit the luxury of postponement of moral judgments. Not to take a stand on the demonstrated urge among some Muslims to die fighting injustices is no less unethical than to try and err on the side of caution. The vain hope that pragmatic accommodations will miraculously result, if peaceful methods are privileged over everything else, does not even begin to address the discourse on ethics and the ethics of resistance in particular, that has complex links with religion as faith as well as religion as identity. Yet seeking unethical recourse in the Islamic tradition can turn out to be a double-edged sword, given the ambivalences informing the debate on whether or not Muslims are justified in taking up arms against oppression in any given situation. Paradoxically enough, this is also the one glimmer of hope on an otherwise extremely dark and discouraging horizon. The contested and fluid meanings of jihad throughout Muslim history suggest that the issue is palpably not a settled one, far less one cast in stone for all times to come. Vigorous debates in the past underscore the imperative of continuing debates in the present and also in the future. If Muslims today are showing a degree of reluctance to grasp the nettle and conduct an open-ended debate on the meanings of jihad, both as idea and practice in Islamic faith and ethics, the reasons are political and not because of presumed rigidities in their religion. Ignoring its multiple and shifting meanings in history, jihad in the aftermath of the attacks on American soil has unfortunately come to signify the opposition between Islam and the West. Perceptions of the threat posed by Muslims to the established global order has provided a lucrative market for a spate of journalistic pieces and also hastily authored works on jihad. The notion that while not all Muslims are terrorists, all terrorists are somehow Muslims, has greatly vitiated the atmosphere and become one of the major obstacles to restoring some semblance of perspective on this much maligned concept of jihad. A columnist of the Washington Post conceded that any attempt to penetrate the mysteries of Islam invariably begins with a discussion as propagated by groups like Islamic Jihad or Al-Qaeda. But as so often happens with code breakers using the wrong combination, such a view of jihad entails attacking an idea that is central, quote, to the daily lives of ordinary Muslims worldwide, while the terrorists get away wrapping their crimes in religious phraseology, unquote. Politically motivated understandings of Islam only serve to harden the lines of division between Muslims and non-Muslims and are grist to the terrorist mill. Muslim and Western analysts have been belaboring the point, some Muslims and Western analysts as well, that the war on terror is strengthening the very groups it is purportedly trying to eliminate. This is being misconstrued in some quarters as sympathy for terrorism rather than as a genuine attempt to clear the air for a meaningful dialogue across the great divisions, both within and between the two untenable monoliths of Islam and the West. Equating jihad with violence and terror makes a sheer travesty of a concept which, for all the distortions and misperceptions, remains the key ethical principle in Islam. In inviting Muslims to abandon jihad, the protagonists of the West are erecting imaginary walls of religious opposition in an ineffectual attempt to disguise their political biases against Islam. There are also those within the Muslim community who have their own reasons for encouraging the misconceptions of their rivals. Both parties are guilty of deliberately confusing temporal political concerns with supposed religious divisions for opportunistic reasons. It has to be accepted. I have no time to develop the various periods and shifts in the history of jihad, but certainly I think it has to be accepted that the turning point really came in the theory and practice of jihad with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, especially given the nature of the resistance that was built up against it. The common tussle between Islam and the West is clearly being played out on a global stage, yet its spatial center of gravity, it has to be admitted, lies in Pakistan, especially in the northwest region. Contemporary ideologues of jihad whose stormtroopers have fought in Afghanistan and then in Kashmir, find some inspiration in the legacy of the Jamaat-e-Islami leader, Maulana Abul Ala Maududi. However, they clearly depart from his certitude that jihad has to be sanctioned and directed by the state on the basis of the advice rendered by religious guardians. In a dramatic break from the Islamic tradition, what was previously considered as the lesser jihad has become the greater jihad. And moreover, today's so-called partisans of Allah have no qualms about jihad being declared and waged by non-state actors. This is a clear break from the classical tradition. This is not to say that they do not revere heroes from the past. The eagerness to become a martyr is seen by contemporary military organizations as sanctifying armed warfare against perceived injustices perpetrated by the enemies of Islam. Abdullah Shaban Ali, whom I quoted at the start, in his last will and testament, urging his mother not to weep for him, not to mention his poem on dying, is really, about death, it has clearly a very strong emotive quality about it, but in exemplifying a widespread desire among militants to become shaheeds or martyrs rather than ghazis, warriors of the faith, it raises an extremely troubling question about the erosion of an ethics of humanity amidst the brutalization of war. There have always been, and still are, South Asian Muslims who upheld jihad as a spiritual and ethical struggle to be human. Notable amongst them was the great poet of Urdu and Persian, Mirza Asadullah Khan Ghalib, whose lament that human beings fail to live up to the standards of humanity and claim, and very important claim, that giving up one's life in a jihad is insufficient recompense for the supreme debt owed to God, who after all gives you life. He is the ultimate life giver. These two ideas have never ceased inspiring Muslims in the subcontinent and presumably also elsewhere. He may have been aware, Ghalib may have been aware of a spurious tradition, hadith, aimed at discrediting the early Khawarij threat to Islam, where the Prophet Muhammad is said to have declared, quote, "During the last days there will appear some young foolish men who will say the best words, but their faith will not go beyond their throats," i.e. they will have no faith, and will go out from them and take leave of their religion as an arrow goes out from a bow. So wherever you find them, kill them, for whoever kills them shall have a reward on the day of resurrection, unquote. Instead of being an intrinsic part of faith, far less of ethics, claims to the contrary notwithstanding, the idea of jihad as struggle has become the aqidah, the belief of certain segments of Muslims in the South Asian context, notably of the Ahle Hadith and its contemporary manifestation in the militant Lashkar-e-Taiba, for whom faith is based on a series of closures, internal as well as external. It is this constricting of the heart and a narrowing of the mind that has turned the would-be partisans of Allah and their campaign and has reduced the concept of jihad into a violent struggle against infidels, whether armed or unarmed, innocent men, women, and children. In that sense, is very much a politics of identity. Like an arrow that has left the bow and gone wide off the mark, jihad in the modern world is a political weapon with which to threaten not just non-believers, but more importantly, perhaps in certain contexts, also believers. Only by retrieving the arrow and straightening its jagged edges and twisted feathers can Muslims ever expect to achieve the high ethical values that are the embodiment of their faith based on belief in God. But for them to have a good chance to do so, things have to change, and I think the discussion moved to the hardcore realities of political issues and the negotiations that must lead to their resolution. Until then, without a clear, even playing field, I doubt that the great doyen of Urdu poetry, whom I greatly admire personally, is unlikely to stir from his grave and assert that things in life can be easier for those who try repaying their debt to the Creator by trying to respect the rights and dignity of fellow human beings, irrespective of their religious denominations, far less their ideological ones. Thank you.
Good morning. On the 31st of August 2001, the Human Rights Committee, which is the treaty body which monitors states' compliance with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, published General Comment number 29. This comment deals with the standards states are required to meet under international human rights law when faced with public emergencies that threaten the life of the nation. In such emergencies, states are empowered to derogate from some of their human rights obligations and to take measures strictly required by the exigencies of the situation that are not permitted in ordinary times. There are clear limits to that power, and the Human Rights Committee saw fit to spell them out. In the timing of this general comment, the Human Rights Committee proved to be prescient. 11 days after it was published, the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon took place. In the period immediately following 9/11, it seemed that the standards and limits of international human rights law, including the provisions for states of emergency, were simply cast aside. The United States declared war on terror. It adopted harsh measures internally without even declaring a state of emergency or examining to what extent such measures were consistent with its international human rights obligations. The United Nations Security Council met immediately to address the situation, and on 28th of September 2001, acting under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, it passed Resolution 1373, which, inter alia, obligates states, and I quote, to take the necessary steps to prevent the commission of terrorist acts. No mention was made in this resolution of the duty of states to ensure that such steps would not deviate from their human rights obligations or from international humanitarian law. In my mind, this was particularly portentous since Article 103 of the UN Charter provides that in the event of a conflict between the obligations of United Nations members under the Charter and the obligations under any international treaty, the Charter prevails. And it did not take long for some members of the United Nations to say, well, we are free from our human rights obligations because we've been directed in a binding resolution under Chapter 7 of the UN Security Council to take measures as we see fit to counter terror. Fortunately, within a fairly short time, the Security Council realized its mistake, and subsequent resolutions declare, and I quote, that states must ensure that any measure taken to combat terrorism should comply with all their obligations under international law, and they should adopt such measures in accordance with international law, in particular human rights law, refugee law, and humanitarian law. Nevertheless, in a keynote address delivered in 2005, the United Nations Secretary General, Kofi Annan, stated that, and I quote, while human rights law makes ample provision for strong counter-terrorist action, even in the most exceptional circumstances, he regrets to say, and once again I quote, that international human rights experts, including those of the UN system, are unanimous in finding that many measures which states are currently adopting to counter terrorism infringe on human rights and fundamental freedoms. Now, these two decisions, the declaration of war by the United States and the original Security Council resolution that made absolutely no mention of human rights or international humanitarian law were both taken in the heat of the moment. They reflected the initial gut reaction to 9/11. 5 years have passed since 9/11, and hopefully we are somewhat wiser and can now take a more dispassionate look at the role law can and should play in the efforts to prevent and suppress terror. I welcome, therefore, this conference on the war of terror, where we stand, and I want to thank Layla particularly and the other organizers for inviting me to participate. In my comments today, I will confine my remarks to issues of international law, although I think that quite a lot of what I have to say may be relevant in the context of domestic law as well, but I certainly do not see myself as an expert on the domestic law, certainly not of the United States. And I wish to relate, if time permitting, to three issues. The first, and in my mind the most important, is there a war on terrorism, or should there be? Number two, what has been the effectiveness of international law and international institutions? And the third and most, I think, salient issue is what is the place and role of international human rights in the struggle against terror? So let me begin with some remarks on a war on terrorism. The very term war on terrorism raises two issues that must be addressed. The first, do we have a war? And second of all, can we speak of terrorism in general, or must we be more specific? Let me start with the notion of war. Like many other international lawyers, I naturally regard the term war on terror, or the term war on terrorism, with a large degree of suspicion. It's not that I do not share the perception that domestic and transnational terrorism presents us with a serious problem that must be addressed both on the international and domestic levels. However, describing a phenomenon as war has serious legal implications. These relate to the model of law employed when fighting terror, and choice of that model has a decisive influence on the type of measures that may lawfully be taken to prevent and suppress terror. And it is important to spell these out. The legal model of law, or armed conflict as we now generally call it, differs radically from the law enforcement model with which we are all familiar. First and foremost, and people seem to forget this, wars are fought by organized armed entities. In the classical model, of course, these entities were states. In modern times, they may include non-state actors, organized armed groups who carry out sustained armed activities. But in all cases, we are talking about an armed conflict between such entities. You do not have a war on or against a phenomenon. You have a war between entities. But secondly, the most important basic principle of the law of war is the distinction between combatants and civilians. In what is now generally called international humanitarian law, this principle emphasizes, of course, the special protection afforded to civilians. However, implicit in the distinction is the license under the laws and customs of war to kill enemy combatants without due process of law. The law of war also recognizes the power of a belligerent state to intern enemy aliens and combatants without trial. Now, of course, I'm fully aware that in many other contexts, the term war has been used not in the legal sense. We've talked about the war on drugs and the war on crime in various contexts. However, in this case, by declaring war on terrorism, a clear statement was made that the war model would be employed, that measures which were compatible with the law model and not with the law enforcement model would be used. And given the group nature of the war model, this has served to justify categorizing individuals according to their perceived ethnic, national, or religious affiliations rather than according to their individual actions. It has served to allow targeting of individuals who are suspected of being involved in the activities of terrorist groups. It has been used to justify detaining large numbers of persons without due process and without putting them on trial before a court of law. Many believe that the results have been not only an undermining of international human rights standards, but increased alienation of members of groups whose support is essential if we are to succeed in preventing and suppressing terror. Now, I must make it clear, rejection of the war model as a general model in the struggle against terrorism does not imply that there may not be situations, times and situations in which the struggle between the armed forces of a state and between organized armed groups, or sometimes between organized armed groups themselves, may not actually reach the level of an armed conflict. We do know examples where it has, and there's a challenge to the states involved and to international lawyers today to decide exactly what model of law applies, especially when you've got transnational groups involved in what could be an armed conflict. However, that's saying that a particular violent conflict taking place in a certain area and a certain space of time is an armed conflict is quite different from asserting that all measures against terrorism are part of such a war. Such a categorization, in my mind, is both wrong legally and highly dangerous. Now, the second issue is the issue of terrorism. While some international conventions dealing with aspects of the effort to prevent and suppress terrorism contain definitions of terrorist acts, the international community has not been able to achieve consensus on a generally accepted definition of terrorism. The obstacles have been political and not conceptual. The two bones of contention have been the demand by some states to include use of armed force by states against civilians, and the demand to exclude acts performed by peoples resisting foreign occupation. Notwithstanding this failure, there's wide consensus on what we are talking about when we speak of terror or terrorism. The main point, of course, and this came up in the discussions yesterday, is that the term refers to the means employed irrespective of the aims. And this is reflected in the specific conventions themselves and was made perfectly clear by the outgoing Secretary General of the United Nations in his final report to the Security Council. Kofi Annan stated, "In order to constrict the pool of those who may resort to terrorism, we must make absolutely clear that no cause, no matter how just, can excuse terrorism. This includes the legitimate struggles of peoples for self-determination. Even this fundamental right defined in the Charter of the United Nations does not exclude deliberately killing or maiming civilians and non-combatants." It was also accepted by the General Assembly of the United Nations in Resolution 60-1, adopted at the 2005 World Comment, which, and I quote, "strongly condemns terrorism in all its forms and manifestations committed by whomever, whatever, and for whatever purposes." Now, there are some definitions in the conventions. I'm not going to go into them. The point that I want to make, and I think it was made yesterday, and I'm merely repeating that point, but I think it's worth repeating, and that is that the fact that we can agree on a definition of terrorism and on condemning resort to terrorism, and I quote once again, "by whomever, wherever, and for whatever purposes," should not lead us to assume that all those who resort to terrorism can or should be grouped together as one common enemy in the war on terrorism. For while the means may be the same and should never be condoned in my mind, the reasons and motivations for resort to such means differ. And how we address groups that employ terror must depend inter alia on those reasons and motivations. And I think this came up very strongly in the talk of Richard Pape yesterday. There is no contradiction between severely condemning the means used in pursuing a struggle and recognizing the legitimacy of the struggle itself. This distinction is too often forgotten by persons who sympathize with the political aims of groups which resort to terror, and by persons in the line of fire as well. Some who recognize the legitimacy of the struggle itself refuse to condemn the means. and thereby lend moral and political support to their use. Others who condemn the means refuse to recognize that the aims themselves may well be legitimate. For lack of time, I'm going to not speak about the lessons that I think we could learn in my part of the world. For that, one of the failings, I think, in the context in the Middle East, in Israel, and its attitude has certainly been this notion that as soon as you name something as terror, it fits into a whole war on terror, and that it's part of a global movement of terror, which I think has had pernicious results and effects on Israeli decision-making. But just let me summarize this point, because I do want to speak about the two other issues. And first, there cannot be a general war on terrorism. We have to be far more discerning in the measures that may be used in fighting to prevent and suppress terrorist acts. We have to distinguish between different political and social contexts in which groups may resort to terror as a means of pursuing their aims. Now let me say just a few words about the effectiveness of international law and international mechanisms. International law on terrorism was not a tabula rasa when the 9/11 attacks took place. 12 international treaties already existed at the time dealing with terror. However, only 2 states were parties to all those treaties, and not enough states had ratified the International Convention for the Suppression of the Financing of Terrorism for it to enter into force. In a move that arguably circumvented the accepted principle of the international legal order, according to which consent of states is required for impositions of new rules of international law, the Security Council, acting once again under Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter, imposed binding obligations on all member states. These were different in nature from the obligations which had in the past been imposed by Chapter 7 resolutions, as they involve general, abstract, and universal obligations that are not restricted to a particular set of circumstances or a particular situation. Some of these obligations, such as the duty to prevent and suppress the financing of terror, were included in treaties which most states had not ratified. Thus, the Security Council assumed the role of a global legislature, empowered to fill the gaps in international law when it deems this may be necessary to maintain or restore international peace and security. How effective has international law and international legal institutions been in waging the struggle against transnational terror? This is obviously not an easy question to answer, for it involves not only examining what the relative norms of international law are and how far states have complied with those norms, and what international institutions have done in order to bolster compliance, but also assessing what the impact has been on containing terror. The Security Council, when setting up the Counter-Terrorism Committee, issues a report in which it discusses how effective it has been ensuring compliance, at least with the United Nations Security Council resolutions on this. And its latest report shows a mixed picture. While over 150 member states have taken steps to combat money laundering and financing of terror since 2001, and I quote, the report says the slowest progress had been made in areas that depend on bilateral action, such as extradition treaties, early warning, and cooperative arrangements. Less than a fifth of the states which reported to the committee have taken action in that regard. Furthermore, in assessing overall compliance with the Resolution 1373, the Counter-Terrorism Committee's conclusion is, and I quote, the resolution has not been implemented uniformly. Some regions have moved quickly, while others have lagged behind for a variety of reasons. But if we can get some picture of the degree of compliance or non-compliance of states with their obligations, of course it is far more difficult to gauge what impact, if any, this has had on suppressing or preventing terrorism. Of course, I cannot deal with this issue here, and I'm not qualified to do so. But one of my objects in coming to this conference was to hear what others had to say about this issue. And it seems to me that even if we take a minimalist view, a minimalist view that says, well, assuming that the 9/11 attacks were the work of al-Qaeda and one of the objects should have been to weaken al-Qaeda, we heard yesterday from Professor Pape that it's not quite clear that this has been achieved. The most recent issue of The Economist, dated January the 17th, reports that notwithstanding the claims of U.S. President George W. Bush that al-Qaeda is on the run, actually it is on the march. Now, just let me say something about the place and role of international human rights. As I said at the outset, after the 9/11 attacks, all notions of compliance with international human rights and international humanitarian law was cast aside. This was not only reflected in the rhetoric of the war on terrorism, but it had other ugly manifestations, a few of which are worth mentioning but are well known to members of this audience. I won't go into details. We had the infamous torture memo, in which an attempt was made to unweave the internationally accepted definition of torture and to make the claim that in certain cases the U.S. president was freed from this obligation, which is an absolute obligation not to use torture in any circumstances. This memo was later repudiated, but torturing the law, as one of my colleagues, Professor Alvarez, called it, was a sign of the times, the practice of rendition, transferring terrorist suspects to jurisdictions which were known not to have too many scruples about the methods used in interrogation is part of the same pattern. The second issue is the issue of the argument that there are certain black holes in international law, some areas where no law norms apply, and therefore people are totally at the disposal of the executive branch of a given country. Most usually the claim was made by the United States. In my mind, as an international lawyer, I don't think that this is a very credible argument. I have never bought the argument that certain people caught up within the framework of an ongoing armed conflict in Afghanistan could be persons who are not protected by any of the Geneva Conventions, but for lack of time, I won't go into that now. In question time, I may be able to relate to it. The United States went even further in arguing that when acting extraterritorially, its international human rights obligations were no longer applicable. And in considering the report of the U.S. on compliance with its obligations under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, this year, the United Nations Human Rights Committee had the following to say. The committee notes with concern the restrictive interpretation made by the state party of its obligations under the covenant. As a result, in particular, of A, its position that the covenant does not apply with respect to individuals under its jurisdiction but outside its territory, nor in time of war, despite the contrary opinions and established jurisprudence of the committee and the International Court of Justice. Its failure to take fully into consideration its obligation under the covenant not only to respect, but also to ensure the rights prescribed by the covenant. Now, the widely held perception of enforcement authorities in states has been that there's a fundamental tension between human rights standards and the need to prevent or suppress terror. Rather than attempting to address the danger of terrorism through the mechanisms of human rights conventions that are tailored for public emergencies, they rather chose the war model and attempted to unweave accepted definitions of torture and other concepts well accepted in international law. But I want to end by the following note. It is all too easy to counter these regrettable tendencies by simply repeating the mantra that human rights standards must be respected at all times. Unfortunately, and I say this as a person who's been connected for many years with non-governmental organizations in the field of human rights, in the understandable and laudable attempt to maintain human rights standards, some NGOs and other human rights activists at times underplay the seriousness of the issue involved and especially the duty of a state under international human rights law itself to protect its citizens against terror, and the real difficulties and dilemmas with which law enforcement authorities may be faced in preventing transnational terror. It is not surprising, therefore, that some of these organizations have been accused of showing little concern for protection of the rights of the victims of terror. However, and this is the point, despite this criticism, it seems to me that the human rights lobby presents a view that too often seems to be ignored by state authorities. For obvious reasons, the latter tend to take a short-term view based on what they see as the need to provide immediate security, while ignoring the longer-term implications that their actions may have on the very security that they are trying to protect. The alternative view presented by human rights advocates is that adhering to human rights standards is not only required on principle, it may very well provide a preferable recipe for long-term security. Research from societies which have a long experience dealing with terror and violence, and I'm talking about Northern Ireland and Israel-Palestine, seems to show that abandonment of human rights standards and use of indiscriminate measures that impact on wide populations from which terrorists originate may have the effect of strengthening the sense of solidarity within such populations and increasing the support for the terrorist activities of small groups identified by others with those populations. Thus, rather than countering terrorism or containing terrorism, the counter-terrorist measures favored by some authorities may play a role in perpetuating and stimulating it. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Yes. Within the general broad outline of the panel, I will speak on my observations on pitfalls in the study of terrorism. First, more than 3 decades ago, Hannah Arendt, in her book on violence, wondered why there was no systematic study of violence. Today, I wonder why there is way too much study of violence, particularly that is perpetrated by Arabs and Muslims. Is there such a thing as too much study of violence or of terrorism? And whether that has any impact on American foreign policy and how it's received or disapproved in various parts of the world, especially in the Middle East. There is something wrong when more Americans know of notorious terrorists of the Arab world, Zarqawi, Zawahiri, Abu Nidal, than they know of writers, poets, scholars of the region. I often say to American audiences across the United States, rarely any of them can name the Egyptian who won the Nobel Prize in Literature, but any of them can name our criminals. This is not to say that there are no terrorists or criminals in the Arab world or among Muslims. Of course there are. My point is that it's high time that Arabs and Muslims become entitled, like other people, to their share of criminals and terrorists without having their culture or religion blamed or maligned as a result of that violence. First, there is a problem, a pitfall in the study of Islam that persists and has become compounded after September 11. Maxime Rodinson, in 1980, in his book La Fascination de l'Islam, talks about theologocentrism. He coined that term in reference to the school of thought in the West which attributes all observable phenomena among Muslims to Islam. It seems to me this has become even more pronounced. I argue that theologocentrism now is not only a school of thought. It is, in fact, an ideology of hostility comparable in its feature to other ideologies of hostility like anti-Semitism. Very much the same scenario, that all Muslims are conspiring for world domination. In the past, anti-Semites used to associate Jews with socialist and communist ideologies. Anti-Muslims today, as was the case on the panel yesterday afternoon, Muslims are associated with fascism. And to do so, people engage in the works of non-experts, people like Paul Berman, who fell into the Middle East after September 11, like many others did, And they find a statement against Western decadence by Mussolini, and they say, well, that sounds like some Muslim complaints. If you read any Christian and conservative complaints about Western decadence in the United States, I think you have to apply the word fascism to a large swath of the American voting public. The book Slouching Towards Gomorrah was written by a former nominee to the Supreme Court, former law professor at the University of Chicago, Robert Bork, and not by an Arab Muslim. Now, it seems to me we need to learn lessons in the major work on Islam by Marshall Godstone, The Venture of Islam, which I think, because it's too massive, rarely read, when he suggests that we use the word Islamicate in order to extricate elements that are affected by Islam among Arabs and Muslims from other elements that are not affected. And there is another book by James Piscatori, I wish it was more appreciated, published in 1984, Islam in a World of Nation State, in which he studies laws in several Muslim states, and he finds out, not to his surprise or mine, but probably to yours, to many of you, that in fact many of these laws are not based on Islam, but are incorporating Code Napoleon and among other civil codes in their practice. There is too much emphasis, fixation on the subject of jihad. Having said all that, it seems to me Muslim apologetic fundamentalists tend to mirror some of the methodology of their own enemies, of these advocates of the ideology of hostility against Islam in the West. They tend to exaggerate the role of Islam too, because it serves their ideological purpose. They also are fixated on jihad, abusing that term very much like Bush abuses words like freedom and liberty. Now, pitfalls in the study of terrorism. I will make some remarks on that regard. First, I think that the very field of terrorism is opposed to the notion of specialization. This is rather counterproductive because it has marginalized experts, people who spend years in order to study languages, cultures, live there. Experts on the Middle East has been marginalized in the State Department. They have been marginalized in American popular culture. And you have a proliferation of the terrorism experts, people who have no training in Islam or languages that Muslims speak, even though they have subscription to memory, as if it suffices. And as a result, their works are filled with inaccuracies and errors reflecting their lack of training. Paul Berman is a good example. Robert Copperman, the doyen of terrorism expert in the United States, who recently died, one time on live TV was asked about the name Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam when it first came about with Hamas usage in the late 1980s. Without flinching, he told viewers on the NewsHour that Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam is a close ally of George Habash of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. For those of you, of course, many know, Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam was a Syrian who fought with Palestinians and died back in 1935. 2, there is disproportionate focus and attention with theologocentric assumptions about terrorism in the Middle East. In fact, the Jerusalem Post, back under different ownership, did a study of New York Times coverage of terrorism, and they found out that in the 1970s, most terrorist acts were committed in Latin America, and yet most New York Times coverage of terrorism was on the Middle East. There is certain propensity. There is a political motive for focusing more on terrorism in the Middle East by Arabs and by Muslims than there is for terrorism somewhere else. For some reason, it is much more noteworthy, even though there are studies that have clearly dispelled the religious motive of Middle East terrorism. And I think Robert Pape's work is very effective in that regard. And the reason it is because he used data, which is not used by people who are making all these broad generalizations about Middle East terrorism. 3, I think there is increased politicization of the term. It seems to me that allows the U.S. government to decide, and the Israeli government for sure, because it is widely received in the United States in its standards and parameters, of whatever they decide. I mean, yesterday when I asked, not to pick on you, Robert Pape about why he, for example, includes attack on U.S. Marines in Lebanon who were involved in the civil war as an act of terrorism, and he said, because everybody does. Well, it seems to me as academics we have to come up with a much better answer than that. It is incumbent on us not to succumb to pressures and standards and terminologies that are being forced on us by governments, particular government, to influence our work. It is in that regard that our work on the Middle East is political knowledge as Edward Said described it. It is political knowledge because it is susceptible to influences by the U.S. government or by the Israeli government, especially in regard to terrorism. You wonder if you want to study or establish a center on data on women in the Middle East region, you wonder how much money and funding you will get for that, as opposed to, say, if you want to study suicide bombing. I think we have to resist the temptation to succumb to the standards of the governments that are launching wars in the name of fighting terrorism today. 4, there is a very clear yet rarely questioned infusion of pro-Israeli advocacy and advocates in the field of Western study of terrorism. In fact, there is a large number, disproportionate number, of Israeli experts on terrorism who fill the ranks of many think tanks that study terrorism in the United States and in the West in general. 5, there remains continued insistence on the exclusion of Israel from the label of terrorism, which I think only makes the study of terrorism in the West more unpalatable to many tastes among Arabs and Muslims. I mean, I think it is legitimate for Palestinians to ask how many of their own civilians have to die over how many years before one act, not two, one act of violence by Israel against civilians will be described in the West as an act of terrorism. I mean, we live today in an age when fighter jets, F-18, are used to assassinate Palestinians in apartment buildings in crowded streets of Gaza, one of the most densely populated areas in the world. And that is accepted, not an act of terrorism. 6, there is a political resistance to the root causes analysis. People are in the United States afraid to address the root causes, even though I think you can legitimately argue the root cause analysis is much better in order to undermine the support for terrorism towards eliminating terrorism altogether. We remember how Rudolph Giuliani, who became a hero after September 11 for reasons unbeknownst to me, insisted that nobody can speak about the Palestinian cause. He made it absolutely a taboo. And it was very successful because you're not supposed to say it. For me, I argue the reverse. On September 11, I could only think all that day, for some reasons, about Robert Forrestal, the Secretary of Defense of Truman, who kept warning about the consequences of America's recognition and support for Israel and its impact on America's standing among Arabs and Muslims for years and decades to come. So more root causes analysis, I think, is important politically, methodologically, and more. It seems to me without it, we cannot understand the context. I mean, somebody would say, instead, they focus on the individuals. I mean, Peter Bergen yesterday was talking about, well, Muhammad Atta didn't go to madrasas, and he was from a privileged family. All that is true. But these people come from an environment. If you don't understand the environment from which they come, people will be able to provide Bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, and others with other recruits in the future. 7, there is clear inconsistency in the application of the definition. Pro-Western groups are scrutinized less than anti-American groups, even though all of them may perpetrate acts of terrorism. Cuban terrorism, of course, is a good example in terms of sentencing and prosecution in the United States. 8, the application of the Islamic or Arab label on terrorism by Arabs and Muslims, while there is no reason for it. I'm sure we would never hear the word Presbyterian terrorism, Jewish terrorism, Methodist terrorism, but yet people casually speak about Islamic terrorism. I think they want to do that in order to imply as if there is a particular brand of terrorism by Muslims, different from any other violence by any other groups. In reality, it seems to me Muslims are much less pioneers, much less original in the practice of violence. Just for remembrances, first, and you can find this information, many of them in mainstream sources, including mainstream Zionist sources like Walter Lacker's A History of Zionism. First bombs in cafes in the Arab-Israeli conflict were not thrown by Palestinians, but by Zionist groups on March 17, 1937 in Jaffa. First bombs on buses were not by Palestinians first, from August to September in 1937 by Zionist groups. Bombs in markets were not first originated by Hamas, by Zionist group, July 6, 1938 in Haifa. Bombs in hotel were not pioneered by Palestinians. July 22nd, 1946, in Jerusalem by Zionist groups. Bombs of embassy, October 1st, 1946, in Rome by Zionist groups. Ambulances, October 31st, 1946, in Tikva. Letter bombs were first used in the Arab-Israeli conflict by Zionist groups in 1947, June, in Britain against British targets throughout the United Kingdom. 9. The employment of standards that are not based on the equality of human life in the evaluation of terrorist acts. Terrorist acts are judged with tremendous regard to the nationality, religion, ethnicity of the victims as well as of the killers. So less expensive humans, like Arabs or Muslims, gets much less attention and counts as victims. Conversely, acts of terrorism by non-Arabs and non-Muslims, by Western groups, whether American troops in Afghanistan or Iraq, who continue to kill civilians regularly in the name of fighting terrorism, or Israeli acts of violence against Palestinians, do not get the attention or the label that violence by Arabs receive. 10. The treatment of suicide bombings as uniquely Islamic phenomenon or as a form of political violence as if different from other forms. Here, I think Robert Page did the most effective job in dispelling that, so I won't elaborate. 11. The exaggeration of the political significance of groups that perpetrate spectacular terrorist acts. Here, my message is to Middle East experts, not to the general audiences. I think it is incumbent on us to resist the popular culture and political culture's pressures to treat insignificant groups, politically speaking, like Al-Qaeda, like, Abu Nidal's group in the past, as if they speak for Islamic or public opinion. I mean, this is why the Islamo-fascist label absolutely does not apply, and this is why all calls for jihad by bin Laden and others have fallen on deaf Muslim ears. And this is why the whole membership of Al-Qaeda can fit in a room or amphitheater or cave or two, no more. And this is why what Hannah Arendt wrote in Origins of Totalitarian will convince you that that term does not apply to these groups and movements. These are insignificant groups, even though they may be able to commit spectacular acts of violence. The one anarchist who killed President McKinley, I mean, that was a spectacular act. Doesn't mean that anarchism was a vibrant movement in the United States and people were studying at the time. I think there are many political movements that have nothing to do with terrorism or Al-Qaeda that needs much more attention than they receive. 12, it is often forgotten that groups that commit terrorism emulate terrorist methods and modes of action of their enemies, whether Palestinians in Palestine for their struggle, and whether Iraqis against Americans in Iraq or in Afghanistan. 13, it is rarely questioned as to why the United States should be an objective arbiter as to decide what is terrorism and what is not, especially when, A, the definition of terrorism by the United States has been clearly moving at fast pace and changing. So now, it used to be, when I first came to this country, it was targeting of civilians for political reasons. Now, I mean, anybody who targets, I guess, the expensive humans, you know, Westerners or Israelis, even if they are armed combatants, that person will be regarded as terrorist and the act will be regarded as terrorism. Now, of course, it is true, there is victimhood from September 11. Absolutely. But this victimhood is not unique. I mean, September 11 is not unique to the life of humans. Of course, this was a horrific act that was visited upon the United States, but the United States visits September 11 on the lives of other people regularly. If you sanction American and ending wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and Somalia and elsewhere in the region, in proxy or directly, you will then give permission to all the Muslim and Arab victims of American and Israeli bombs to do the same, and I'm sure you wouldn't. So one has to be careful about what sanction you give to the United States in response to September 11. Israel has visited much more than a September 11 on Lebanon in the last war. In the last war, Israel's war on Lebanon, 1,200 Lebanese were killed. And an overwhelming majority of them were civilians. Hezbollah killed 140-something of Israelis. Overwhelmingly, they were military. And yet, if you want to consider Hezbollah as a terrorist organization, which you may, you certainly have to consider applying that label to Israel, which at least in that confrontation killed more civilians of the other side than vice versa. Otherwise, I mean, there is a problem of terminology, or more, ideology. 14, I think we have to speak about what Edward Herman called the terrorism industry. The extent to which the terrorism industry and the funding of terrorism industry, its links to government, is affecting the production of that industry. 15, why is the pursuit of terrorists and terrorism in all forms and manners is justified when it kills as many innocent civilians as terrorists do? And what if we reach a point when the pursuit of fight against terrorism or pursuit of terrorists can equally be considered a terrorist act if it kills as many civilians as terrorists do? Finally, I think terrorism doesn't seem to be going away as long as there is a consensus in favor of violence internationally. The only difference is that people who practice violence, they never call it terrorism, consider their violence sanctioned and praiseworthy, and they consider the violence against them very much terrorism. This is very much like the theologians who used to argue about what is considered to be just war. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. And I actually did not receive two of the papers due to the fact that our speakers were traveling internationally and were unable to send the papers to me. But like you, I sat down and listened and profited from the presentations. I thought that Professor Jalal's presentation was a particularly eloquent attempt to put the topic in its cultural and historical perspective. I found Professor Kretzmer's comments and analysis to be extraordinarily enlightening, trenchant, and deeply humane in its reach and analysis of the various dilemmas for international law and the corrosive effect that the war on terrorism has had on our own domestic and international situation. And of course, Professor Abukhalil spoke passionately and analytically and thoughtfully about the politics in the study of terrorism. I want to be brief in my own comments because I think these were very stimulating and provocative presentations, and I'm sure there are lots of questions and comments that I'm anxious for us as a panel to get to and listen to and participate in. So let me limit my own comments to a few points and maybe develop a somewhat different perspective on some of the issues. First of all, I think when we talk particularly about the causes of terrorism or the explanations of terrorism, we have to keep in mind that in spite of the fact that this is receiving enormous attention today, terrorism, and in particular suicide terrorism, that was the focus of our discussion yesterday, is still a relatively rare phenomenon. And therefore, explaining it by bringing in various population characteristics, political circumstances, and so on, is not, from a methodological point of view, let's say it's a very, very challenging task. Let me draw a comparison very quickly. A somewhat related phenomenon, suicide. That too is relatively rare, but not nearly as rare. In the United States, every year, somewhere between 28 to 30,000 people commit suicide. And we have had, in the social sciences, a history of at least 100 years or so since the classic work of Durkheim on the study of suicide. And still, it seems to me that we are very, very far away from developing any kind of persuasive or compelling explanation for the causes of suicide, the social rates of suicide. And particularly, I think we are all very much aware that the kinds of explanations that are developed in one cultural setting may not be applicable to another. So I think what I would counsel is intellectual modesty and caution as we set out to explain in a causal fashion the phenomenon of terrorism. Now, we have talked about the political dimensions of terrorism or suicide terrorism, the so-called strategic logic of suicide terrorism. I would suggest that these are all from the perspective of the victims of terrorism, or those who are concerned with the eradication of terrorism or the war on terror, and so on. And I think if one focuses on the groups that set up the terrorist so-called martyrdom operations, that identify the sites, provide the weapons, provide the ideological justifications, occupation being one, surely, yes, there is logic, there is utilitarian, there is rational, strategic considerations that come into play, and I think Professor Pape's explanations are quite compelling in that regard. But what if we were to look at terrorism from another perspective, namely its victims, not the victims in the United States or the Western victims, but the impact that it has had and is having on the societies in the Middle East where it is happening, which is the focus of our attention for much of this conference, on the terrorists, the suicide terrorists themselves, who are also victimized, and on the population, and on the environment of these societies, the cultural environment of these societies. And here, since Hannah Arendt's name was mentioned, let me point to another statement or observation that she made, which I find to be particularly relevant, at least to the perspective that I'm trying to develop. And this comes in her work on Eichmann in Jerusalem. I'm not drawing parallels between Islam and fascism and so on. That's not my attempt here. But in the course of analyzing Eichmann in that trial, she reports that from time to time, Eichmann, who, as you know, was responsible for the transport of millions of Jews to their final destination in the death camps, he would pause for a moment, and as he put it, as Eichmann put it, he would have the temptation of not doing what he was doing. But then he would decide that the call of duty would mitigate against such temptations and would go on doing what he was doing. in that context, Arendt raises the question of what is the moral environment within which saving the lives of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people is viewed as a temptation. Now, I think there's a profound lesson in that for our discussion. What is the moral environment that is being created in the societies in our part of the world in which a young man, presumably as intelligent, as moral as any young man anywhere else, is willing to sacrifice his own life and to commit horrible acts of terror on a Friday morning as people are walking out of a mosque, having said their prayers on the first day of the holy month of Ramadan. And what is the moral environment that justifies, well beyond the matters of occupation, the kind of sectarian violence that we see, and I believe it's going to continue relentlessly in the weeks and months to come, possibly even independent of the occupation. Now, these are issues that I'm personally concerned about, that it seems to me from the point of view of the ethics of whatever phenomenon it is that we are talking about, must be addressed, and they must be addressed from the point of view of those who come from the religion of Islam, from this cultural environment, and somewhat, I hope, independently of the kinds of ideological concerns that we all have and are entirely relevant as well. Now, in that context, my own work and my own attempt has been to show, I think much as Professor Jalal was showing in her analysis of the concept of jihad, that this does not happen in a willy-nilly fashion. It takes an awful lot of intellectual capital, a great deal of effort on the part of those who work on the cultural, on the ideological, on the theological aspects of this, and develop the kind of environment that sanctions violence, that draws lines of moral exclusion and legitimizes the kinds of attacks that we see. That, to me, the analysis of those movements, the transformation of the concept of martyrdom, for example, from the willingness to bear and to suffer for one's faith to a very proactive, warlike attack involving the lives of hundreds of others in this democratized way that anyone can be a martyr regardless of one's history, regardless of one's intentions, as long as you commit the act of martyrdom. And martyrs become heroes in the cultural environment that I'm talking about, that parents take pride in the fact that their young children have indeed become martyrs. Now, of course, I'm entirely mindful of the political circumstances that lead to that and provide these kinds of justifications. But I'm equally concerned about the impact of this way of thinking, of these kinds of cultural and religious explanations for martyrdom, for jihad, and the like. And I've been studying the phenomenon over the past 100 years or so, and again, I can't get into it now, but all I want to impress upon you is the transformations of these ideas within the time span of roughly a century or so in in the subcontinent, in Iran in particular, sometime before the revolution, during the Iran-Iraq war, and to the present. So it seems to me that at some point we, as intellectuals concerned with the study of Islam and the Middle East, we who hail from the region, we who believe in the religion of Islam, we have to own up to this dimension of the problem as well. While it is in no way independent of the kinds of political considerations that we have been talking about, it seems to me that it requires attention in its own right, and the impact that it has on the image of Islam around the world, the impact that it has on the conduct of our political affairs, on the direction and contents of our political culture. All of those things are important. They can't be dismissed, and I hope that in our conversations we will attend to this dimension of the problem that is terrorism in terms of its corrosive impact on the moral and ethical environment of the societies within which it is happening. This too should be part of our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all our panelists. I'd like to open the floor now to questions, both from the panelists themselves and, of course, from the floor as well. My only request would be that you identify yourself and keep your question as brief as possible. Professor Bloom? Please.
Okay. Hi. My name is Mia Bloom. I'm a professor at the University of Georgia. I wanted to ask Dr. Abukhalil, which I thought the presentation was very interesting, but I also wanted to maybe push you on one or two issues regarding the use of violence. I think that it's not untrue that there has been a focus on violence, in part sometimes maybe because that's where the money is. With the creation of these Department of Homeland Security, $12 million centers, terrorism, which was not particularly interesting for a decade, all of a sudden became interesting because professors, universities, and others saw the entrepreneurial aspect to it. But this is where I'm going to caution you. I worked very closely 15 years ago with an Israeli professor named Ehud Sprinzak, who wrote extensively on Jewish terrorism. I work on not just Islamic terrorism, but a comparison of Islamic terrorism with non-Islamic terrorism. But I would say that if you were to go to any Boston bookstore, the IRA section would be very impressive as well. So that this is where I'm not disagreeing with the very strange focus, and maybe some of our priorities have shifted. Be that as it may, I was hoping maybe you could comment then as well on the growth of what seems to be legitimation within Islamic, either fiqh or Islamic specific leaders, to acknowledge and allow sectarian violence between Sunni and Shia.
I mean, there's more than one question in that interesting question, which is okay with me. Several things. On the question of funding, I think there is certainly a motive of profit for people who want to pursue certain careers or dissertations, and there's more funding for certain topics than others. I don't believe it's new. I think it has always existed since when I came to this country 23 years ago. I think there is much more of it than before. Yes, there are people who study Jewish terrorism, and Ehud Sprinzak is one of them, and you and I know of his work, and I wonder how many others do. Certainly the ones who do that don't get as much attention, don't get as much coverage as the ones who do Muslim terrorism. But most importantly, what do acts of Jewish terrorism lead to? Do they trigger wars against them? Do countries mobilize? Does the Security Council meet over the issue? Is it the same kind of renunciation that an act of violence lead to by a Palestinian against Israel? I mean, one time there was an act of violence, terrorism by my standards, against civilians in Israel by Hamas or Islamic Jihad that prompted the U.S. president to go to Israel to show his sympathy. I mean, again, how many Arabs have to die for one show of sympathy to be exhibited on the part of any American official? So certainly there's an imbalance, even if there are some people here and there doing that. The last part of your question is about whether there is legitimization for violence. Universally there is, yes. I disagree that this is something peculiar to Muslims or to Arabs. I mean, the Afghanistan war was supported by 93% of the American population. 93%. And, well, of course, it's justified for many Americans. I mean, 93% of them. But what is the reality of that war? According to U.S. Central Command figures, up to March of 2003, we don't have the figures after. I don't have the figures afterwards. Something like 22,400 bombs and missiles were dropped on Afghanistan. But they bragged that the technology of warfare has improved, so a mere 25% only missed their targets. Hundreds of bombs and missiles missed their targets. In the Iraq War of 1991, according to Navy figures quoted in Rick Atkinson, no lefty source, Washington Post reporter, in his book Crusade, in the 1991 war, up until February of 91, something like 88,000 tons of bombs and missiles were dropped on Iraq. According to Navy figures, more than 70% of them missed their targets. So, I mean, and yet, these are popular war. So, is there a difference between legitimization of acts of violence by Arab groups or legitimization of acts of violence by American groups? For me, I mean, if you measure it by the amount of people killed, I mean, certainly a lot of people have been killed in Afghanistan and more than any other place in Iraq as a result of American war and occupation.
Yes, sir.
Robert Iguchi. This war on terrorism started when the war on communism ended. Did the political leaders in this country need a new war? Is the dog wagging the tail or the tail wagging the dog?
Could you direct a question to the panelists?
Just the whole panel.
Would anyone like to address that? No. Yes. Yes.
I'd like to thank the panel. My name is Ronda Lester. I'm completing my doctorate degree here at Kretzmer and I also teach at the Political Science Department. Oh, thank you. I guess I have an observation, and I'm interested in your opinion, Professor Abukhalil. I am also sympathetic to your statement about the focus on terrorism as Islamic terrorism and the simplistic and lack of nuance in the field in general. But as someone who is completing a dissertation which includes both human rights norms and security studies, and I would put myself as, or hope to be, a counterterrorism expert, and I'm also Israeli, it seems to me that you first levy this criticism and then you sin in demonstrating the same thing, because your assumption is that all Israeli counterterrorism experts are pro-Israeli, although I hate that term. And I think that in the field of academia and certainly in policymaking, the field is much more nuanced and complex than that. Then you also focus on Israel in the same kind of, I think, a lack of nuance and very simplistic. There is a disproportionate focus on Israel as well. Israel is the only country that can't be a member, eligible to be a member of the UN Security Council. Many of the emergency sessions in the UN in the past 15 years, I think almost all of them, in fact, if I'm not mistaken, have been focused on Israel. Many of the General Assembly resolutions are disproportionately focused on Israel. That is not to take away from the consistent violations of human rights norm and humanitarian law that Israel actually violates in the occupied territories, and it doesn't diminish the grievances of the Palestinian people. But it seems to me that if you want us to have a more nuanced and complex view of the world that we live in today, then you should probably demonstrate that as well here, and I'm not sure that that was the case. So I'm interested in why are you focusing on one country when you're levying the same criticism?
If I read your question correctly, there are two layers. One is about terrorism experts, and one is about singling out what you thought was Israel. On the terrorism expert, no. I mean, I think you misquoted me. I did not generalize about all terrorism experts in Israel or elsewhere. I would just make an observation about the infusion of a very disproportionate number. I said infusion of a disproportionate number of pro-Israeli advocates among the terrorism experts. There are many terrorism experts that I cite and I use in my classes. I mean, Robert Pape is now, whether he wants it or not, is a terrorism expert, and I use his book in my classes, and I think it's very good and very effective. Ehud Sprinzak, work on the Jewish right in Israel has been, I think, very important. So no, I mean, I don't generalize about any group or any people, so certainly I cannot be accused of that, and I didn't say that. So I don't think you're being accurate to what I said. I was just raising some words of caveat about the nature of the field itself, not because of any genetic qualities of people who are in it, but I think the relationship of the terrorism industry and the political knowledge and the temptation to succumb to the general prevalent standards in America, especially after September 11, where dissent is particularly unacceptable and where there is a demand for patriotic academics, as well as from everybody else. On the second subject about singling out Israel, I mean, of course I did today. I mean, I made a particular point to single out the state of Israel because it gets away more than any other state that I know of. I mean, I lived half of my life in Lebanon, the other half here in the United States. I am from South Lebanon, so I was very familiar with Israel back home. And then I came here and I see a very different side to Israel that is totally unrecognizable. To my own experience, I do not forget about, but even if you want to forget about, the ordeal of the Palestinian people over the years. And it is for that reason, because American audiences are not accustomed to including Israel in any discourse about terrorism, I wanted to do that. And that was my intention. So the first thing was not my intention. The second thing was on purpose.
Yes, sir. Could I just ask again that the questions be as brief as possible so we can get as many in, and direct it to a particular panelist?
I'm Joseph Alroy, born in Palestine but Israeli. And one small correction. Yes, there were a lot of called terrorist acts before the State of Israel. But keep in mind that the leadership in Israel in those time fought against this terrorism, delivered. Some of them have been arrested as a result of the leadership in the country to try to avoid this.
May I say briefly? Oh, I mean, I don't know whether they arrested. I mean, Ishaq Shamir became prime minister. I think it's a very important position in Israel.
Ishaq Shamir was jailed by the British at the time.
He later became prime minister of Israel. Menachem Begin became prime minister of Israel.
Okay.
The opinion today, we made a lot of mistakes, but the leadership at the time, unfortunately, a suicide bomb caused the election of Bibi, and there we have a fallout. So a lot of things, it's not a single thing.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Hello, my name is Dexter Van Zyla, and I work for the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting in America, and that may prove decisive for some people in how they interpret my question. I am not Jewish. I am a Christian, but I am not a premillennial dispensationalist or a Christian Zionist in the technical sense of the word, or the agreed-upon sense of the word. My question has to do with whether or not there is an ideological threat in the Middle East. George Kennan basically said, ultimately, that ideological threats typically end up manifesting themselves as physical threats. And I think that may actually be what's happening, and that ultimately it's not just the West or the United States or Israel that's going to be suffering as a consequence of that threat, but the countries itself where this threat is manifesting itself. And I think Dr. Banuazizi addressed this issue, and I think obliquely up, the consequence of some of these teachings, they may arise in response to nationalist concerns, but they're going to have long-term consequences for the societies that embrace them.
I didn't hear a question, so we'll continue. Ma'am, you had and then.
Question to the panel, and particularly to Professor Abukhalil, who seemed to distort a little bit what I said yesterday. So, for the record, I'm not an apologist of the Bush administration. I've been very often critical of Israeli politics toward the territories, and I never conflated the concept of Islam with fascism. What I did yesterday, however, was an attempt to explain a certain form of Islamism, which could be any other form of religions, with a historical period, an interwar period, with fascism. So that's to frame, first and foremost, what I said yesterday. You seem to suggest that I was not doing that. What is interesting in this effort is when we distinguish between tactics and ends. The question that we have to keep in mind, even if we are on the side of the underdog, but the goals is anti-human rights, anti-democratics, what do we do? It's a very, very hard question. If we all have a commitment for democracy and human rights, what do we do with those groups, whether they are Muslim, Islamist, not Muslim, and others? And yet, we know that at the end of the day, if they take power, women will not have equal voting rights, for example. So that's one important question that was in between the lines when I was speaking yesterday. And what I was trying to suggest is that it's precisely because it's not Islam that is belligerent that we have to go to see in a different part of history what the West has done in terms of irrationalist ideologies to support visions that are an anti-enlightenment. It's precisely because it's an anti-essentialist argument that we have to go beyond Islam to look similarity and commonality. And it's precisely because of that that we have to seek the answers that were provided at the time to see what we're doing today is correct, flows, or we should simply update it to the new conditions of our days. So I just want to make sure that we're on the same page because I heard those implicit accusations.
Well, I think you confirmed that I did not misunderstand you at all. And I think that I am clear that I did not in any way accuse you of being an apologist of the Bush administration. I don't know where that came from. But on the general subject, certainly, I think that the declared objective of democracy in no way changes the quality of violence exercised by a particular group or state. We've seen in the case of the United States the large amount of civilians killed in Iraq and Afghanistan. Certainly, democracy in the case of the United States has not in any way tempered or restrained the ability of the United States to kill a very large number of civilians in those countries. The second point, on the subject of feminism or women's rights and the declared Western concerns for that. In a book by Layla Ahmed, Women and Gender in Islam, she talks about colonial feminism. Colonial feminism refers to the practice by colonial officers in Middle East and Muslim countries in the past, when they used to champion women's rights in Muslim countries, and they themselves used to oppose women's rights in their own countries, and women's enfranchisement. We remember Lord Cromer in Egypt, how he used to speak about women's rights in Egypt, and he was a declared misogynist back home. We've seen that in the United States. We have seen a revival of colonial feminism in the Bush administration, and even by some liberal feminist group like Feminist Majority, who used the issue of women in Afghanistan to cheerlead and prepare the country for war against Afghanistan. And when the case was over, the war was achieved, there was absolutely little attention to what happened to women in Afghanistan. I think there is legitimate concerns about fundamentalism in women. From my own perspective as a radical feminist, I guess, I would say that there is certainly a threat, but I refuse to think that there is... we have to recognize the similarities between Jewish, Christian, and Muslim fundamentalism. I think they are... Islamic fundamentalism is not more obscurantist, not more misogynistic, not more sexist, not more anti-secularist than Jewish or Christian fundamentalism. So if one is truly concerned about women's rights, one has to be consistent in fighting against the manifestation of fundamentalism in all these religions. In all these religions.
Yes, ma'am.
My name is Ruth Barris, and I guess I just have a comment, which is maybe somewhat depressing, but I guess in thinking about what you've been saying, and the war on poverty was mentioned, and just as I'm an Arab American, I'm Lebanese, and as an American, I can say this country, I mean, the war on poverty seems to have become a war against poor people. I mean, since that war was fought, the gap between the rich and the poor in this country is more. Unfortunately, Americans who know the culture and language, we discriminate against our own terribly. The price of a life in downtown Boston is different than the price of a life in Sudbury. So it just kind of puts into context that, you know, the uphill battle to have the American mind open to root cause interpretations. It's pretty overwhelming, you know, and as an individual, I tell people I'm Lebanese whenever I can, just to bring up whatever conversation can help dispel whatever preconception they might have. When somebody says something negative about, you know, the poor, it's their own fault they're poor. You know, to me, that's the same thing as, you know, those Arabs deserve to die, or the hell with the gays. You know, I mean, it's prejudice and closed-mindedness in every form that's sort of underneath all this.
I have, my name is Matthew McCandless. I'm a recent graduate of the Fletcher School, and I work for the State Department. I have two questions, one for Dr. Kretzmer. Assuming that the United States re-embraced both legal international law and domestic law as a primary vehicle for dealing with terrorist groups, and the international realm, in your opinion, is there sufficient substance to the law, first, and secondly, organizations to pursue that war in the current context? And I ask because I think many people would probably agree that the conflict that we're dealing with today with Al-Qaeda is very different than what was envisioned by the scope of international human rights law and the laws of war that originate, you know, many decades ago. Second question to Dr. Abukhalil. You mentioned that we should, academics in particular, should be focusing or should not focus on exaggerating the influence of groups like Al-Qaeda within the Muslim and Arab world. And I definitely agree with that. But what is your perception then on polling that was conducted several years after 9/11 in certain countries in the Muslim world, and the non-Muslim world for that matter, in terms of popularity of individuals, leaders, and one of them was bin Laden. And in some countries like Jordan and Pakistan, the approval ratings for bin Laden, without any substance of the detail of why there was approval of those individuals, was alarmingly high. Is that because we've boosted his image as a fighter against whatever ideology, or the U.S. or international law? Or is there something, is the support there only paper thin and temporary, or is there something more there? Thank you.
Professor Kretzmer.
There is a division of opinion on the question that you answer. There are two schools of thought. There is indeed the one school of thought who believes that international law is not at the moment fully equipped to deal with the kind of conflict that you could say that you have between the United States and Al-Qaeda. On the one hand, if you use the law enforcement model, you're largely dependent on the cooperation of states and of international organizations, and we know that some of the states are not prepared to cooperate in that. If you turn to the armed conflict model, assuming that you've reached the level and scope of violence to label it an armed conflict, and you look at international instruments dealing with armed conflicts, they only deal with either interstate conflicts or conflicts occurring within the territory of a given state.
And so what you could say is a transnational conflict doesn't, as it were, fit into the categories. But there's been a lot of writing since then. And I think the generally accepted view, and that would be the second view, is that the principles are there and they can be applied if you want to apply them. They're not perfect, but they're better than no principles at all. And what frightens me, I'll be quite honest, and I said so plainly and simply in my talk, is trying to work with a model in which it's claimed there's no law whatsoever and there's no international law, and it's all at the discretion of the head of the state of any country. And then that is what leads to the kind of things like the torture memo and internment of people for years and years and years without any recourse to any court or to any other mechanism for their freedom. And that has to be avoided.
Thank you. Yes, my point on this subject was in fact directed at academics, because I think when you see this proportionate attention to Al-Qaeda, just as we saw that for Abu Nidal back in the 1980s, and Abu Nidal commanded the support of no more than 200-300 people, like in total, at his heyday. And I worry that in the same sense that we may translate the media and government obsession with bin Laden and Al-Qaeda with appreciation of a political phenomenon that may not exist. I remember after September 11, just anecdotally, I went to Lebanon with the intent purpose of looking for evidence of bin Laden's support, and I went to like poor areas, Sunni areas, looked at all the graffitis on the wall, and all throughout that trip after September 11, I found one graffiti, and it says bin Laden. I never encountered anybody in many talks I gave. I spoke at a refugee camp in Burj al-Barajni, and I said something against Taliban. One guy stood up and said, don't criticize the Taliban, and he left. He was mad. So, you don't see any evidence of any support for Al-Qaeda or these groups in terms of mass support. I think public opinion is a field that is, shrouded with a lot of controversies. There are people like who talk about it in America, like Jalal or Fishkin at University of Texas, Austin. But suffice to say, when people are answering that question, what are they saying? They are not necessarily saying that they subscribe, not even to the horrors of Al-Qaeda, which public opinion surveys show that people were overwhelmingly opposed to September 11 in many Muslim countries, even conducted by American public opinion surveys. But I think they are saying a provocative message. It's like between bin Laden and Bush, that's what they are saying. And certainly, they are intensely anti-Bush. This is like a Palestinian once was asked by a Washington Post reporter on why some Palestinians displayed support for some tyrant like Saddam Hussein, who never displayed any concern for the Palestinians, just as bin Laden never did in action. And the Palestinian said, look, we are desperate. If the monkey offers support for Palestinians, we support the monkey. And the monkey in this case is either Saddam or bin Laden.
Thank you. There are a number of other questions. I see hands up, but I'm afraid we've already 5 minutes over our allotted time, and we have to leave time for the next panel. Please join me in thanking our distinguished panelists for their